clothing, everything was available to them as that community grew. But unfortunately, it still wasn't enough to support the continuing growth of the black community in Rochester. And due to racism, which was alive and well back then, even into the modern day, they still did not feel safe outside of these two communities that were starting to grow. It was always interesting to me to see this photo of Carissa Street, and during a congregation or a parade, to see the top hat of Kodak kind of staring down at the community. I alluded to it a little bit earlier about these interesting residential policies that started to spring up as more and more families were coming up to the south into the Rochester area. And we have the beginning of what was known as redlining or restrictive covenants. This started out as a federal initiative. It was the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation that was starting to figure out where best to provide insurance and aid to mortgages and refinancing. Every area that received financing had restrictive covenants, and they were color-coded. Basically, the areas in green, they were good to go. Their mortgages would be insured. The areas in blue and orange, or I'm sorry, blue and yellow were questionable. They needed more information. The areas in red, no go, absolutely no support. So that meant banks are not getting federal support for their loans. They feel that certain loans to certain families are too risky and they would not give mortgages to certain families. If you know the city of Rochester well, and you heard me before talk about Cornhill and Upper Falls, guess what the red areas are? That is Cornhill, that is Upper Falls. So a pattern is emerging. You have these self-sufficient communities, very strong, tight-knit communities, but they are still suffering from outside revenue and outside resources not being able to come into those communities to keep them going. By the 1950s, 80% of black residents in Rochester were living in Cornhill and Upper Falls, known as the 3rd Ward and the 7th Ward. Resources like infrastructure, bridges, sidewalks, roads, streetlights, schools especially, just kept dwindling in those areas until it reached a fever pitch. I am not old enough to remember these, but I have coworkers, and some of you may have remembered a very tragic event that happened here in Rochester that was known as the riots. This was July of 1964, July 24th. Rochester Police Department was attempting to arrest a drunk and disorderly person at a neighborhood block party on Joseph Avenue. Joseph Avenue was one of the main stretches of Upper Falls. That was about 11 o'clock at night. The drunk and disorderly person resisted arrest. That led to a crowd of about 400 people gathering to protest and to start throwing bottles and rocks at the police department as they were trying to arrest the gentleman. The RPD brought in the canine units, and that became even more controversial. That was like throwing gasoline onto a fire, because canine units were very, very reminiscent of police departments in the South, using them in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. So that did not help the situation. The crowd grew from about 400 people to over 2,000 by 3 a.m. the next day. Governor Rockefeller at the time declared a state of emergency. This opens up resources. This opens up resources like the National Guard. Violence spread from Joseph Ave to Upper Falls, Cornhill, and even parts of 19th Ward. There was a couple organizers that got together that had a list of demands that they gave to the current Rochester mayor, Mayor Lamb. One of those demands was a mayoral, let me take a step back. They had a list of 3 demands. If those 3 demands were met, there was a guarantee that the rioting would end. The first demand was mayoral committee to oversee police department. Mind you, this was 1964. Mayoral committee to oversee police department. Sounds a lot like the Police Accountability Board that was just, we had, so progress is slow. Deputized community members and more resources for black-owned businesses. Mayor Lamb agreed to 2 out of the 3 demands. He would not agree to deputizing community members. So the violence continued until the 26th, when the National Guard, about 800 to 1,000 troops, deployed to Rochester to physically stop the rioting and looting. In the end, 5 people had died. 4 of them had died from a helicopter crash. 350 people were injured, 976 people arrested, and 204 stores looted or vandalized. I have an old coworker of mine I used to work with years ago that was a driver for RTS at the time, or RTC, and he still vividly remembers the smell of the bus seats that were lit on fire. Those were filled with horsehair at the time, so if you're familiar with burning hair, imagine that on an entire bus. In the aftermath, though, we do have a little bit of a silver lining. Housing projects were focused on and built in the 60s and 70s. You have two organizations, the Action for a Better Community and the Urban League of Rochester were founded, and then another community called FIGHT was founded right off of North Clinton, and that stood for Freedom, Integration, God, Honor, Today. Really interesting juxtaposition between two different newspapers describing the events that happened. D&C, of course, and then the Voice, which was a predominantly black-owned and black-read newspaper. I titled this section Urban Renewal because after the events of the riot in 1964, most of Cornhill was redeveloped and streets were actually moved. 1930s, where Clarissa Street had always been, coincidentally it started at Mount Hope. For those of you familiar with the Ford Street Bridge, that was originally Clarissa Street Bridge. That went all the way up to Main Street at the very top left corner there. By comparison, this is what's left of Clarissa Street here, and it ends right before ever making it to Main Street because of 490. So the neighborhood was almost literally cut up, land was moved, streets were moved, and it was a shadow of its former self. Into the modern day, I wasn't able to really feature heavily more contemporary Rochesterians, but I did want to mention them by name. These are some ladies and gentlemen who have contributed heavily to arts and culture and social advocacy and civil service. Doing presentations like this, it's always tough to try and narrow it down on who you're going to talk about, who you're going to feature, but I heavily recommend looking into any of these names. If you can look into all of the names, that's all the better. But these are some more modern day Rochesterians making a positive difference, not only in their own communities, but in the community of Rochester as a whole. And for further exploration, here are a couple of places that I recommend looking. Starting with that publication that Rosetta Douglass Sprague did. The Color of Law was that book cover that I had when I talked about redlining. Free the People is a local organization. Her Voice Carries is that mural project that Sarah Rutherford, a local artist, did. Wall Therapy was co-founded by Dr. Ian Wilson, who was a local radiologist. In This Moment is a book series that was founded by Amanda Chestnut that tells community members' stories. 540 West Main is by Calvin Eaton, and then the Ninth Floor Artist Collective. I know that was a lot of information, and I do thank you very much for joining me in this trek. Again, I always strive to include as much as I possibly can, but I know I miss stuff just by the virtue of having a time limit. I don't have all the answers, but I will happily try if any of you have questions. Yes, Nancy?
Why was it called the Lost Bureau?
The Lost Borough is a lesser-known nickname of Rochester that was developed and came about in the 1980s. It has its roots all the way back to the 1820s. And it stems from the idea that back in the 1820s, starting in the 1820s, we had a number of ethnic communities that were starting to settle in this area. For those of you familiar with Chuck and Gapman Joan, they grew up in a neighborhood that was called Mount Allegro. That was a very strong concentration of Sicilian immigrants that came to this area. There's a settlement up here, right there, which was known as Dublin. Dublin was an Irish community that settled in Rochester. You had a Jewish community that settled in Rochester near Bodden Street in Upper Falls. You had on Hudson Ave, near the St. Stanislav Kostka Church, you had a very strong Slavic community of Ukrainians, Polak, Czech, and Russian immigrants settling in that area. You had in the Lyle Otis neighborhood, which is over here, you had strong Italian immigrants settling in that area, and they all moved to Gates. You had a very strong German community in Dutchtown, which was actually a bastardization of the term Deutschtown, which is German for German. Thank you very much, I appreciate it. Yeah, my son gave me it wasn't RSV or Corona, but it's lingering for the last 6 weeks. You have, in the more modern day, you have Puerto Rican and Latino communities settling in the northeastern parts of the city. All of that, throughout its history, from 18 teens to the present day, or at least to the 1980s, led to the idea that these diverse and unique neighborhoods with their own flavor, their own identity, led to the idea that we are the lost borough of New York City, that we could fit as a community alongside Queens, Staten Island, Brooklyn, Bronx, and Manhattan. And then in the 70s and the early 80s, with the rise of hip-hop culture and music, that all kind of led to that as well. So really long answer to a short question, but that's where, and I also, to an extent, you know, with me kind of, I don't discover anything new, but I do find stories that people tend to forget about, and I like to highlight them again and share them, because, you know, I was talking with another guest before that Rochester is a true mid-sized city. We have little city mindset sometimes, but we are truly mid-sized, and so much has happened here for a city our size that it is almost criminal how much is taken for granted and how much is not memorialized or celebrated. One of the hills that I gladly die on is Rochester being passed off as a Rust Belt city. Geographically, we are in that region, but in my entire existence as a historian and artist, I have only found 3 businesses that had anything to do with metallurgy or major metal manufacturing. We just don't fit that mold that Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Bethlehem, Syracuse, Buffalo, and Gary, Indiana, and a couple other ones fit, that we just are not quite that Rust Belt city moniker. We are also a city that went through 3 unique, distinctly and unrelated industries and dominated all of them. Flour production, we're the world leader in. There is a story of Queen Victoria of the English royal family would only get her flour from the Genesee Valley. Then we switched over as the Midwest woke up and decided they were going to take all of the wheat production in St. Louis and further in the Midwest. We switched gears to nurseries and seed dispensaries, where you had the rise of George Ellinger and Patrick Berry, James Vick, the Brown Brothers Continental Nursery in Browncroft, and Mount Hope Nursery, which is George Ellinger and Patrick Berry, largest business of its kind in the world at one time. There's an urban legend that the first orange trees to go to California started here in Dansville, New York. Unfortunately, that's not true. The Spanish brought them centuries before. But we did have a hand in perfecting cross-country travel of live goods. And then after that, you know, when it was decided that we are a 4-season area and winter tends to happen, there was a young gentleman by the name of George Eastman that decided he was going to play around with this newfangled thing called photography, and then Kodak happened. And then there was another gentleman who was going to play around with this newfangled technology called xerography, and Haloid Company, and then Xerox happened. And then there are these 2 German immigrants who were playing around with glass and make it maybe look like a lens, and then Bausch & Lomb happened. So we became the world's image center, and imaging science was what we dominated. What Rochester becomes next, I have no idea, but we are still kind of in that transitional phase trying to figure that out. Photonics might have been the answer. I don't think it is anymore, but it's, to me, always exciting to be in this area, seeing what we are going to become next. Looking back, we were many things. Looking forward, we can be many more things.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
How active was Parma, Hilton for the railroad to get the slaves to freedom?
I can only guess at it. I would guess Nancy would probably know more than me. I know a lot of the routes were coming from the south and coming from the east. There's a fun debate on if Rochester is considered Western New York or is Rochester considered the Finger Lakes. And the most accurate answer is yes. Because we are just as much Western New York, for those of you who remember when we only shared a zip code with Buffalo until we got our own. Or area code, thank you, not zip code. Yeah, I have zip code in my head because I live in an area where my zip code does not match my town taxes or my school district. I live in East Henrietta. My kids go to West Henrietta schools. I pay Henrietta taxes, but I have a Pittsford mailing address. I'm trying to keep my nose from going up. And every time I have to talk to people who are delivering something to me or want my address, their tone always changes. Like, no, I'm from Henrietta.
That's like when we say we're from New York. No.
Steve, did
Yep,
you,
yeah.
Steve, did you have a question?
Yes.
Did the public market area have any significance in the history of the slaves and so on?
So the public market, where it is right now, is the third, technically fourth iteration of the Rochester public market. That's the fourth home of where it was. It was a rail yard before. It was 1904 or 1906 that the public market moved to that current home, or that current spot. That neighborhood, Market View Heights, didn't really have a name before the market moved there. It was just known as, I forget the ward number, but the entire city was organized by wards. And that area, to my knowledge, was mostly farmland. Barns were a very big magnet for the Underground Railroad because they were very easy to hide people. So it's very possible, but I don't have concrete proof. But as far as the public market, where it is now is its fourth home. Its third home was the end of Main Street Bridge on the Granite Building side. I'm sorry, no, Andrew Street Bridge on the east side. Its second home was the Center Market Building, which is where the federal building is now on State Street. And its first home was the north side of Main Street Bridge. Back in, you guys may even remember this, but up until 1967, there were actually buildings on Main Street Bridge. You could live literally over water, which is fascinating to me. In the very beginnings, farmers would bring their produce and goods right to the north end there, and there was just kind of an open area for them to sell. But as far as I know, like Commissioner Row, which is where those buildings are, and Java's is there, and Public Provisions, and Fiorella, and Velvet Valley. Those buildings are early 1900s, so it would have been after the Underground Railroad, but I don't know for sure. Oh, one other thing I was going to mention. There's a story that people like to talk about during the Underground Railroad with quilt patterns. If you've ever heard of the story that people on the Underground Railroad would signal to people escaping slavery with certain patterns of quilts hanging on their clotheslines to tell them where to go, and it is a beautiful story that is bullshit. And I would love for it to be true, but unfortunately, the education level of people leaving the South, combined with the communication styles that were available, which is basically word of mouth, just it wasn't feasible to have this intricate means of communication to tell people leaving where was safe and where wasn't. It was just, if you were escaping slavery, it was educated guesses and literally going by your gut what was safe, what wasn't, and you genuinely did not feel at peace, at safe, whole until you were in Canada and another country. Because the Fugitive Slave Act was active well past 1850, 23 years after New York abolished slavery, so it was still risky to even be in free states. But yeah, that's another story that Genesee Country Museum likes to tell. They don't give it any credence. They say it was fake, it was false. But if you go to like George Eastman's childhood home at the museum, they do have a quilt hanging on one of the clotheslines, and that's where they talk about it.
Matt, thank you very much.
You are very welcome. Thank you guys very much. My contact info if you're interested in anything else. And again, thank you very much for having me.
We have one more job. We have a 50-50 here, and we usually have our speaker draw the tickets.
You're gonna put a lot of pressure on me. I'd be happy to.
Not that one.
Good, get to the bottom.
Yep, I'm gonna go with this guy.
Okay. Here we go. 478-997. Do I hear anybody have that number? 478-997, or 977, I'm sorry. I said it wrong. 977, the last three digits.
Somebody.
977?
You got it? 977?
Yep, 478-977.
Very good, Steve.